They don't want what we know out there. You'll never get this on CNBC. But our school system will never tell us that, because they're part of the process. Fake money, fake teachers, fake assets. I know the game of the rich. My rich dad taught me. You know it because you're the banker. The bankers and the rich play is different than what they teach you in school. All over the world, what does school teach you about money? And the answer is nothing. And that's not a mistake. That's not an accident. I knew that. Most people know that. The way to keep the poor and middle class working hard is never teach them what the rich know. So if you read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which came out in 1997, it's what the rich teach their kids about money, the poor and middle class do not. Poverty hurts. I mean, I don't like it. And I don't like that our academic system's so corrupt. You know, we know the banking system's corrupt. We know politics is corrupt. But academics is just as corrupt.
I mean, one thing if it's the banking and the politics, but this is where we send our children and we trust them to do the right things for them, and yet they're being not taught something so fundamental. Like you asked your dad when you were a kid, Dad, you asked your teacher, when are you going to teach us about money? And it was just
never.
Well, never.
And they'll never will. You know something. What do you know? Share it. What is financial education? It's not get a job, work hard, save money, and invest in a well-diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and ETFs. The financial industry is two things, debt and taxes. In 1971, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, and the US dollar became debt. And we still tell kids to go to school, get a job, work hard, save money, and get out of debt. Now, who tells them to do that? That's the most ridiculous thing there is.
The book starts and it says, lie number 1, saving money will make you rich.
Yeah, it never will. You know that.
All taught that as kids.
Why would you save it and why would you work for it if they can print it faster than you can work for it? Why do you keep saving when they're printing it? The rich don't work for money. Don't you touch that stuff.
It's very subtle, right?
Yep.
They don't say, I'm going to train you to be a worker bee the rest of your life, but they educate you in a way where that's what you come out.
Right.
What else was what was he trying to do those first few months were you working for him? What was he trying to get across to you? Because he taught you the hard way about money.
And she says, if you're going to be successful in your life, you've got to find the best teachers. And a great teacher is somebody who comes from the inside, not the outside. But in school, you don't know if your instructor is for real or not. That's where the fake teacher comes from. I said, I want you to teach me about money. So why should I teach you? He said, but if I teach you, you work for me for free. And I said, why for free? And my poor dad went nuts. He says, because if I pay you, you think like an employee. Your brain will change. If you learn never to work for money, you'll be a rich man.
And this is powerful. Once you give someone a paycheck, their brain turns off.
Correct.
Because it's...
And then the promise of a pension.
Right.
And job security.
Which is kind of a paycheck in disguise.
Correct.
After you stop working. Give the man a fish, eats for the day, teach him to fish, eats for a lifetime. And most poor people confuse assets for liabilities. They think their home is an asset, it's actually a liability.
Right. An asset is a noun, like a house. Cash flow is a verb. So to understand if it's an asset or liability, it takes a noun plus verb. So if the cash is flowing out of your pocket, it's a liability. If the cash is flowing into your pocket, asset, verb, it's an asset. So I own 7,000 rental properties. Those are assets. Every month, the cash flows in. Whereas many people have the big house on the hill and the cash is flowing out.
Right.
And they're going broke.
Right, it's like a frame of mind. The other thing the poor don't understand is the number one expense for most people is taxes. And yet we don't even see it. Isn't that weird? You walk around and you look at the paycheck and say, that doesn't seem right, and you don't realize that the government's got a huge hand in your pocket and you are doing nothing to minimize that. Again,
Correct.
This is what's very different about the rich and the poor.
The rich don't work for money. His number one expense is tax. See, there's three kinds of income: earned, portfolio, passive. So earned income is if I get a job, that's earned income. If I'm a doctor or a programmer, that's earned income because I'm working for it. If I buy, let's say, Apple for $10 and I sell it for 20, that's portfolio income, capital gains.
Yeah.
But passive income, which is cash flow, is never taxed. And so these guys are screaming right now in America, tax the rich. I said, good luck. Because most of the guys complaining, they don't know there's three kinds of income. And the rich don't have jobs anyway. They have assets. And so the average schmo out there, a poor guy, sent the kid to school, they don't learn this. You see, very few people will buy what I do, make $1 million and pay zero tax. And my rich dad taught me that playing Monopoly. That's how it started, 4 greenhouses, 1 red hotel. Or the McDonald's formula, I write about it here. McDonald's, Ray Kroc.
Yeah.
McDonald's is in the real estate business. So they sell hamburgers, but they buy real estate, so they pay no taxes. This guy Bezos, he's $16 billion. How much tax did they pay on that $16 billion? Zero.
And that's all legal. Anyone can do it.
Everybody can do it.
But most people lack the education.
So once you learn how to use debt as money, you can never say, I can't afford it. You see, because the banks will give you, so the banks, after the crash of 2008, the banks gave me $300 million tax-free. When I asked the average guy, I said, why don't you use debt? They can't even get a loan because their scores, their FICO scores, I don't even have them here, are so bad. The school teachers will never tell you that because they don't know it. My poor dad never knew that. You don't know if something is an asset or a liability until you can say which way the cash flows. So a house, is it an asset or liability? Well, if it's taking money from your pocket, it's liability. If it's putting money in your pocket, it's an asset. The US government wants me to provide housing, wants me to provide jobs, wants me to borrow money because that's how money is created through debt. I get huge tax breaks. Everybody can do the same thing if they had the financial education to do it. If people understood the tax code, we'd be more prosperous.
But can poverty be passed through genetically?
Yes.
Because it's some type of way of thinking.
It's an attitude.
An attitude.
It's very simple. When people ask me, how do I stop it? I just say, never say, I can't afford it. Ask yourself, how can I? The reason I have so much money is because I don't say I can't do it. I just go, how can I do it? And I just go and do it. I make a lot of mistakes, but that's how I learn. How can I? The poor people, like my poor dad, always said, I can't afford it. Do you think I'm made of money? I'm a school teacher. I can't do that. And I picked that up. And my rich dad never said those words. So when I meet poor people, they use the words I can't a lot. So the people that say, I can't afford it, I can't do this, I can't get to college, the rich are evil, I choose not to participate in that.
And that's one thing people could change today.
Correct.
Right now, is that dialogue in their head. Stop saying the word can't.
I can't.
Right.
So how can I?
How can I? Especially as in, I can't afford it, how can I afford that?
Right.
Because that opens them up to looking at it as an investment to a greater future.
Right. When I borrowed $300 million, I couldn't do it until I went to ask. And I got turned down so many times. I said, and every time I showed the banker my financials and he'd go, sorry. I said, look, do me a favor. Why did you turn me down? And he'd tell me, this is out, the numbers are out here. So if I get these numbers fixed, can I come see you again? He goes, sure. So it's called rejection. Same as my wife rejected me for 6 months. It's just a matter of personal willpower, which is spiritual. Just saying, if they can do it, I can do it.
And how can I?
How can I?
And I think it's you once said, words become flesh.
Yep. That was the Bible too. Intelligence increases through your mistakes, through the ups and downs, through what you've learned. Real estate's real estate, but what I learned made me richer, not the money. You don't need money to make money. I think all of us, every human being has that low point in their life. And if they get the message, a new life begins. If they don't get the message, they keep going down. The richer I got was because I didn't need any money. I could use this to make money. But how did I get there? Is I made a lot of mistakes. people are afraid of making mistakes and all this, fear of failing, it limits them. Nice, so very nice. So many people trapped in the same device.
The wealthiest people on earth, the reason they're multi-billionaires is not because they have 100 rental units. The reason they are multi-billionaires is because they have a company that's valued at multi tens of billions, and they just take a loan out whenever they want. And the best part is loans are tax-free. Now I live in Dubai, so I don't need to worry about tax anyways, but that's really how you get to the hundreds of millions.
What's holding people back from excelling beyond average? Do you think it's talent, belief?
I think people don't do very much. I think people do a lot of talking about doing, not a lot of doing. And I think it's the doing that does everything. And I think and whether it's lack of motivation, lack of focus, lack of 100 different things, it just comes down to number of actions taken per unit of time. And I think the vast majority of people just wildly underestimate the volume that's required. And I think that's like, I hit on this so hard because like when, I'll tell you a story to illustrate the point. When I had my first gym, I had a mentor who told me that he got all of his leads off of flyers. And so that's what he did. And so I put out a flyer and I waited 2 weeks and one guy called me and said, "Hey, you dinged my Mercedes." And I was like, it's the only call I got. So I called the mentor up 2 weeks later and he was like, "Hey, how'd that go?" And I was like ready to I was like, "It didn't work," and he was like, and he like totally took it in stride. And he was like, "Well, what was your test size?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" He was like, "Well, what was your test amount?" I was like, "Well, I mean, I put out 300 in total." And he was like, "Oh man," he's like, "hard to know if anything's going to work with 300. He's like, "We test with 5,000 per batch." He's like, "And then once we find a winner," he's like, "we do 5,000 flyers a day." And I was like, "Oh." So he's doing 150,000 flyers a month for his business and I had done 300. And this is why I think the vast majority of people dramatically underestimate how much volume it is. Like, I mean, right when we started this, you're like, "Seems like you tweet all the time." It's like, I post that often on a lot of platforms. Now, Twitter is my home base for where everything is generated from. But like we make 450 pieces of content a week. And so people were like, "Hey man, I've been making content for 90 days. And that would already put them in the top, 1% because everyone gives up. But if you actually made a post every day for 90 days, I'd be like, "It's amazing. That's 90 posts." I do that in 2 days. And so, but they get there and they're like, "But I'm not Mr. Beast yet." It's just, and there's just, people think that someone else is doing 2 times or 3 times as much, but it's more often that they've done 1,000 times or like 10,000 times the amount of work that they have. Like if you counted the amount of videos that you've put out in terms of longs and shorts or minutes of content that you've put out over the last 4 or 5 years compared to somebody, it's not even, it's like, it's so ridiculous, the discrepancy. Same thing with sales guys. They're like, "Hey, I've been selling for 90 days. So I'm like, "Okay, so how many calls a day do you take?" And they're like, "I end up taking, 5 or 6 live calls." I'm like, "Okay, so you've been doing it for 90 days. You've taken like 400 live calls." It's like, "Okay, well, this is John. He's closed 4,000 deals. Not calls taken, deals. That's why he's better than you." It's just like, there's just a dramatic misunderstanding. And that probably with a 30% closure, he's taken 12,000 calls. It's like, he's done 300 times the work you have. Like it's a lot, or 30, but like it's a lot more than people expect.
So how do you compete with that guy? Because I bet there's a lot of those guys out there.
You start. I mean, I think it's like, you just start. And I think it's like, a huge amount of the delay that happens when people are starting out is the amount of time it takes for them to realize there is no easy way. So they spend a huge amount of time, they figure out how to do it. And then they spend a really long time trying to figure out if there's an easier way. And then they give up trying to find an easier way. And then they just start the hard way because the hard way is the only way.
How often do you get emotionally tied to outcomes?
I would say less and less over time. I'm sure that it depends on the outcome. It depends on the outcome.
What outcomes are you still emotionally tied to, even though you may know better?
Well, I think if the book launch for my next book that comes out, like if that goes well, I'll be stoked. If it doesn't go well, I'll be bummed. Like those are like, and I would say on a micro level, like we always hope that a YouTube video does well. We hope that, but obviously we have our constraints of like, okay, well, do I want this to be for a business owner audience or do I want this to be for more of a beginner audience? If it's a beginner audience, I have to kind of recalibrate my expectations because it'll get way more views. So, it's not like I'm a robot. I think I would say that my emotional regulation's just gotten better over time. It's not like it doesn't exist.
What other parts of your identity have you had to kill to become where you are right now?
Plenty.
I know one was attachment to the approval of your dad. That's something that's been spoken about quite often. Any other?
Yeah, I think so. It really depends on how we define identity. But if we define that by the actions that we take, like if you were to describe somebody like he is this way, you really describe it by the actions that person does, right? It's very hard to say someone is something without doing something about it, right? We even describe people by what they do. Like he's a carpenter, he is selfish, which means that he acts in selfish ways. Like it's all based on activity. And so for me, like the changes in behavior, which then ladder up to identity, I've had to become more patient. I've had to figure out, which I define as figuring out what to do in the meantime. I've had to just have times where I'm like, I just need to let the turkey cook. I just gotta let it cook. There's nothing like I shouldn't. The right task for me to do is nothing. I've had to learn that.
Wasn't an easy change to like
No,
permanently
it's
adjust
horrendously
that?
hard. No, and I don't think it's permanent. I think you have to fight it every day like addiction.
And so you think there are certain characteristic traits people just naturally have, or aspects of their identity that they will have for their entire life. They just have to be able to detect which ones keep them weak, and then it's an active battle for the rest of their life.
I guess instead of anthropomorphizing, so kind of like humanizing the things that we're fighting against in terms of behavior, it's more thinking like, I have been rewarded in the past for behaving in this way. And so it's hard for me to change that behavior, but I realize that behavior no longer serves me. Now, you're still going to have the memory of the reward of doing that thing over and over again. And so what's really tough about human behavior is that punishment fades, but reward sticks. Meaning, like when you go out and drink, if you drink too much, the next morning you're hungover and you're like, I'm never going to drink again. But then a week later, you're like, you remember the reward, but you don't remember the punishment, right? And it's the same reason that people go back to ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends. It's like they remember the good times, but they forget about the bad times. So punishment fades, but reward sticks. And so the hardest behaviors to change are ones that have rewarded you in the past, because you will tend to remember the reward and want to repeat them. And so the only way to really beat those is to find something to do instead that rewards you better.
What's one of the things that worked for you in the beginning that stopped serving you as you've gotten bigger or more successful?
Well, one of the biggest ones that I talk about is when you quit the job and you start entrepreneurship, you get rewarded really big for taking a risk, for doing something different. But you don't need to take those kind of existential risks all the time. And the problem is that you get a massive reward for doing so in the beginning. And then you almost have to immediately unlearn that and then stick with this current path for an extended period of time. But you kind of always remember the hit of trying something new, which is why I think so many entrepreneurs tend to always want to do lots of new things, when most of the time they need to just get better at the thing that's in front of them and confront whatever problem they don't know how to solve so that they can get that thing to the next level. And so they think that by doing something new, because that's what worked for them in the past, that's going to get them to the next level, when in reality, they just end up distracting themselves and trying to chase 2 or 3 masters at a time. And
whatever industry you pick, if you outwork everybody, if you try to be a little smarter than everybody, if you try to be a better salesperson than everybody, if you try to be better prepared than everybody, you've got your best chance. Because if you don't do it and somebody else does, you know, I have the saying, work like someone's trying to take it all away from you. You know, I actually work like someone's spending 24 hours, working 24 hours to take it all away from you. And that's kind of the way I look at it.
What would you say is the number one reason why people fail?
Lack of brains, lack of effort.
Lack of brains, lack of effort.
Yeah, they don't do the work. They don't learn, you know. When you walk in the room, when you start a business and you start to talk about somebody, you're never in a vacuum with no competition, you know, unless you're just extremely lucky. And if there's going to be competition, that means somebody else knows your business as well as you do when you get started. And if you walk into a competitive environment and they still know more about the business than you do and more about your customers, you're going to lose. But most people don't consider that. They don't do the work. They don't learn more about their industry. They don't know even about their business. I mean, and so you've got to put in the effort to know more about your industry than anybody else. And that's the brains part, and that's the effort part as well. Because look, if you're competing with me, you better know what you're doing, otherwise I'm gonna kick your ass, you know, and you're not gonna outwork me. And so, you know, the combination is usually what kills businesses early on more than anything.
You could, within a 5-10 minute interview, say, this dude's not gonna make it as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, I can typically tell, right? I can tell by their passion, I can tell by their focus, I can tell by their preparation. You know, there's a whole realm of things in any business. Here, you know, here's the business you're in, and here's 1,000 things that influence whether or not you're going to be successful. You know, through my experience in businesses, I can put myself in his position and say, okay, here are 900 of the 1,000 things he has to be aware of, and then go through and ask. And by how many of those or her issues they've been able to address already, that kind of gives me a sense of how hard they're willing to work. You know, and I can tell by the questions they ask me. So all I have to do is say, okay, what do you want to know? And when they start saying, what should I do?
They ask you.
Yeah, and that's fine, right? And I want them to ask questions, but people like to say, the only stupid questions are the ones you don't ask, and that's not right? Because the questions you ask tell whoever more about you than anything else you do. Because in particular, it tells me about your preparation. If you ask me questions about just basic things that you should have known and you should have down to a science, that's going to disqualify you almost more than anything. If you're not always learning, to this minute, if I'm not continuously learning, if I'm not just absorbing as much as I can absorb, someone else is going to kick my ass, right? So you talk about paranoia. The greatest source of your paranoia should be knowledge. If someone else knows more than you do, and if you're not learning, if you don't know how to learn, if you don't have a thirst for learning and acquiring information, you're SOL.
Do you think there needs to be a healthy level of paranoia?
Oh, absolutely.
There needs to be.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I always say, for every one of my businesses, I said, what would I do to kick my own ass? Right? So whatever business you have, there's somebody trying to put you out of business. There's somebody trying to take a bite out of your business. And it's better for you to figure out how they're going to do it rather than they do it. And so, yeah, that's being paranoid. And so you have to be paranoid. You have to anticipate other people's next moves. And you can't ever, downplay the competition. I was at a business plan competition this morning at a college, and they were kind of being dismissive of the competition. And so you can't ever do that. They're out there trying to take you down, and they're not just going to sit still. And if you're good, really, really good, you're going to inspire them to work even harder, faster, better. And so you have to be, very self-aware of what you're good at and what other people are good at. And, a healthy dose of paranoia makes a big difference. Is very helpful.
Let's transition to a different subject with college. You went to IU,
Yep.
right? Now you got a lot of people that say, forget about school,
They're
drop out
idiots.
of school.
They're idiots.
So you think they're idiots?
They're idiots.
Tell me why.
If you're going to have and run a business, if you don't understand accounting, you're already behind the 8 ball.
Can't you hire a guy that knows how to
But
run
then
accounting?
they still have to communicate to you. Your accountant might tell you you're profitable, but your cash is going down. Not understanding a breakdown. And when you don't,
You think you need college to learn that?
yeah, I think you do, right? Because it may not, for some people, look, if you're so self-motivated that you can take an online course in accounting and teach yourself everything, you're way ahead of the game anyways. But most people aren't. I don't care if you go to a community college and take accounting and spend $99 for the class. Just, spending the money forces you to be more obligated to do it. But accounting, finance, lesser extent marketing, sales if the school offers that. These are that's the language of business. And so while it's possible to teach yourself these things, and while it's possible to hire them, when you're starting your own company, you don't want to have to spend money hiring an accountant. Well, let me take that. If you've gone through all these classes, you probably don't have to hire a lawyer to incorporate, right? You can probably figure out yourself. And so your cost of opening up a business drops. But even more important than all that, that's the blocking and tackling. That's the language of business. The thing I learned at Indiana that was more important than anything else, I learned how to learn. And learning became far more important to me, because the one certainty in business is that it's always going to be changing.
How does one entrepreneur increase the speed in areas that they can increase? There's certain things you can't control.
Speed in what way?
Speed of growing your business.
All right.
So how fast can I grow it?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends. You've got to know your own skill set, right? And you've got to know how that fits within your company's life cycle. Some companies are slow grind, and you just have to understand that, and you've just got to bide your time until it starts to click, and then grow with it quickly. If you're trying to release a product that needs to be ubiquitous, you've got to go as fast as you can, and then
Release a product, like a launch.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who will say, perfection is the enemy of profitability, right? And that doesn't mean you have to wait till it's a perfect product. It really just depends on what the product is. It a barbershop, right? Is it an app? Is it a service? Is it a product? But the key is looking for the low-hanging fruit. What customers are willing to write you a check or commit to it, so that they're willing to integrate it into their daily lives or integrate it into their daily business. And so getting a commitment either through time or revenue is typically what I look for. And so if I can get a commitment, then I'm going to be able to learn. I'm going to see how they use it. Do they sustain usage? And then once I get the next one, you know, hopefully it came a little bit faster than the first one. Then I can ask for referrals, and then the next one, then the next one, and I just try to ramp it up. You know, when I bought the Mavs, we had no season ticket holder base. And so literally it was a matter of just putting a list of former season ticket holders in a white pages back then, you know, on my desk next to my phone and making phone calls.
You?
Yeah, me. Yeah, because if I'm not going to do it, how can I expect someone else to do it, right? So just get on the phone. Hey, this is Mark Cuban. I'm the new owner of the Dallas Mavericks. You know, I'd like to invite you back for a game. It's not though. This is my business.
But you can't get regular sales guys or something to make those calls once they get to a quarter. You're a guy that's a billionaire. You're making those calls.
But that's all, you know, and that's fine and good, right? Because everybody's got their own goals, right? But still, I didn't want anybody at the Mavs to be able to say, well, he's not willing to do the work, right? There's, you know, if I walk around, I'm picking up all the papers. I'm not saying go get that picked up. I'm like, okay, that's trash. I'm picking it up. But in terms of speed of growth, it's really, you got to get that first customer first. And then when you get that first, what did you learn? Reiterate, get that next customer. And then hopefully as you learn more and more through the process, then the next one comes by even faster. You know, alluding to it earlier about entrepreneurs being born or built, you know, and I think I knew I was wired to be excited about business. How or why, I don't know, but you know, and there's certain guys that have the genetics to jump out of the gym, right? There's certain guys, you know, that, you know, when they golf, they have the muscle memory and the discipline. You know, Dirk Nowitzki may not be the most talented guy in the NBA, but his discipline and his focus to do what's necessary to be successful, he's willing to do, and combine it with being 7 feet tall and being skilled, you know, it makes him an amazing basketball player. So it's understanding what your skill set is, finding the right place to use those skills, and then going for it. You know, will that make you 250 grand? It depends if you pick the right industry. You know, I started my first business when I was 12. I was buying and selling baseball cards, buying and selling stamps. Anything I could do to make money, I was hustling and trying to do. So I was into business, but I not so much where it was, all my friends were into it with me, so they wouldn't know.
Baseball cards.
Yeah, baseball cards, you name it. I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh. And so I would, probably even less than 12 years old, I would go out and buy a bunch of baseball cards that I collected, and I would package, I would say, okay, you're guaranteed to have a Pittsburgh Pirate in this package, and I would charge 3 times as much, and I'd set up on this park bench down in the park down in Scott Township where I grew up, and I'd have these little sales, and it was great. I made money, and I mean, it was, you know, and I learned as much about business when I was 9, 10, and 12 as I learned